Right, to the telephone lines we go, and I did mention via Twitter that we'll have a special guest on the show tonight. Last week it was Brendan Finter. This week, a man who knows all about Springbok rugby has been there and has seen success at the highest level. Jake White joins us via the telephone from Montpellier. Bonjour, Coach Jake. Ça va?
Ça va bien, et toi?
Bien, merci. Coach, before we get cracking and before we start, I think it would be remiss of me to not mention up front that obviously we're trying to find solutions. We're not necessarily here to criticize Saru, we're not necessarily trying to criticize individuals within the system, but we want to see the Springboks out on top. Have you been concerned by what you've seen in the last season or two?
Yeah, look, I mean, Zola, thank you. I think that one of the things that has been obviously spoken about is that, firstly, it's not about me trying to find a job, and secondly, I think also, I've always been considered a bit outspoken, and it's not about attacking SA Rugby or the people who make the decisions. I just think that having watched South African rugby from afar, and suppose also dealing with players who are currently involved in playing rugby at the highest level, it's obviously quite interesting to have a different viewpoint as to what I think and what I see, happening back home.
Well, you have been watching from a distance. You've been at Montpellier for almost 2 years now, and you guys did particularly well in the Euro Championship last season. I think at the moment third on the log. How's it gone? Before we cast a closer eye to here at home, for you and all your band of South African brothers, not a bad start to the year?
Yeah, look, I mean, I must say it's going really well. I think that one of the things, again, which I've been lucky enough is a lot of these South African players playing here, and I've got to see a lot of them, not only the ones playing in Montpellier, there are a lot of the other guys playing in the other clubs. And I've got to say, with the feedback from all the coaches that deal with the South African boys, the owners who obviously have them at their clubs, have all spoken really highly about them. They tell me they work hard, they're winners, they want to do well. And I mean, I think they held in high regard at their clubs because wherever they go, they obviously add a bit of value to each club that they're playing at in France.
One of the questions that has arisen, particularly this season, we saw Duane Vermeulen come and join the Springboks earlier in the year, not looked quite what we used to seeing of Duane. Is there a difference, do you think, Jake, in the intensity levels of the rugby played in the top 14 versus what we see in, say, Super Rugby? Or do you think that the players that are based in France battle with the fact that they come to South Africa when they've already had and completed what's been a long and arduous season?
Yeah, look, I think it's a little bit of both. I think, to be fair, it is tough, and when they got to go back and play Test rugby because they play week in and week out, it is a bit of a tough ask for the players. But yeah, I mean, I think that's probably half the problem, Paul. I don't think those players should be playing here. They should be playing back in South Africa. When you say it, you're quite right. I mean, a lot of players, they go back and is the rugby different? There's no doubt the rugby is different here. I mean, if you consider, I'll give you a name of a couple of players that are playing here now. Gutro Steenkamp, Van der Merwe, Bismarck, Du Plessis, Paul Billingse, Jacques, Andre Kruger, Willem Alberts, Duane Vermeulen, Ricky January, Francois Steyn, Theo Aplon, Barnabana. That team would probably beat any of the provincial teams back home, or they'd beat any of the Super Rugby teams at home. So, I mean, that's the kind of caliber of player that's playing abroad. And I've said it not only now, but I've said it when I was at the Sharks. I think that's probably a problem that the decision makers that have made in the past have probably erred on, because they should have tried to find a way to keep most of their best players back in South Africa.
Do you think that whole talk about selecting only locally based players for the Springboks is something that has to be expanded on? Do you think that, knowing that you are, yes, based in France, but do you think that there should be a clear bias to players that are in South Africa?
Well, I think both. I think they should pick players who play in South Africa, but they should encourage every player who wants to leave to stay in South Africa. I've thought about it long and hard. You can't invest 80 test matches in Bismarck Du Plessis before he's 30 years old and then let him go and play overseas. You can't invest 50 test matches in Francois Steyn before he's 26 years old and then get him to play overseas. You can't invest 30-odd test matches in Marcel Coetzee and then get him to play overseas. And the list goes on. Sliaaplan's got 30 tests, you let him go overseas. Willie Leroux's got 30 tests, you let him go and play overseas. So I think that they've got to find a way for those players to stay. And I know that people listening probably say, well, you can't because the money's different. But let me tell you, every owner in the world is trying their hardest to buy players like Bowden Barrett as we speak.
Yep.
And New Zealand find a way to get him to sign a long-term deal in New Zealand. So, I don't believe it's something that that South Africa can't work out. It's keeping those sort of players involved in South Africa for a longer time.
Well, Jake, obviously the reason we've got you on is because South African rugby is in a bit of a quagmire. The Springboks have not necessarily produced the goods of late. Our big talking point on the show tonight is about the tenure of a Springbok coach. Is that perhaps one of the areas in which we're getting it wrong? I know, Motsidisi, that's one of the issues that you wanted to highlight to Jake. Is it? Do we have it wrong in terms of continuity, in terms of what's the word I'm looking for? Succession planning. That we literally hire coaches from World Cup to World Cup.
Yeah, look, I think, that's probably hit the nail on the head. I think succession planning is exactly that. If I just mentioned just now, Kola, you give Marcel Coetzee 30 test matches, and then you let him go play the season, you don't keep him. You invest in 5 fullbacks since Monty retired. I think it might be 5 or 6. It was Aplon, it was Zane Kirshner, it was Jesse Creel, it was Goosen, it was Willie Leroux. At the end of the day, we've got to make up our minds and decide which one it is. Give them as many test caps as we can and let them play there so that at least they can, play there for a long period of time. And the same goes to the coaches. I think... I knew you were going to phone me and speak to me. I did some research. The Chiefs coaching staff have got more years of experience last year than all 6 super franchise coaches have got added together in South Africa in terms of years that they've coached. So I think it's not just about the player. It's about how the systems work and how you become a super franchise coach and how you become a senior coach and what do you need to do in order to go through the levels of coaching at a high level, and I just don't believe too much work has ever been done on that. I think that if we look back at South African rugby, we've won 2 World Cups. If you Google SA Rugby or if you Google rugby in South Africa or if you Google coaching in South Africa, you won't find anything. You wouldn't be able to find any video footage on how to teach a backline to run straight. You wouldn't be able to find a fitness program for a tight head prop in terms of what he needs to do in his gym programs. You wouldn't be able to find, the technique of having to maul around the front of a line-out, and yet we consider ourselves a rugby nation, and yet we consider ourselves as a country where we pride ourselves in how we develop the game. That one goes hand in hand with the other. If you've got no coaching facilities or no pathway for coaches to develop or no succession planning on where you go from coaching first 15 rugby into senior rugby, well, then you will sit with a problem from year to year as we're sitting now, where no one knows who should be taking over, who should be coaching Super Rugby, where do you go in order to get into coaching. And, as I said, I think that there's no doubt New Zealand have shown the pathway there. They've shown you how our coaches go from Super Rugby into the national setup. Our coaches leave their country, coach abroad, and then come back and bring all that intellectual property back. Graham Henry, Steve Anson both coached overseas. As we speak now, Vern Cotter coaches Scotland. Joe Schmidt coaches Ireland. Warren Gatland coaches the Lions and Wales. So you just got to raise your hat to them because at the end of the day, they've obviously sent their coaches around the world to pick up whatever they can and bring it back to New Zealand.
I mean, Robbie, you currently coaching in the local setup. Do you think we've got enough insofar as developing local coaches? And do you find there's direction from the top? Is everybody on the same page, or are different unions left to their own devices to develop their coaches at different speeds?
Yeah, I think they are left to their own devices. Even Jake, I think you hit it spot on. I think, in South Africa, there's this big thing about retired or ex-rugby players becoming coaches, particularly at Super Rugby level, almost straight after retiring. And, I do believe that most coaches need a progression. You've got a guy like Kieran Reid that's assisting at a school in Christchurch at the moment because he wants to get into coaching after rugby. And you've got to learn grassroots before you can take the big step into junior provincial, then senior provincial rugby. Otherwise, you're never going to realise exactly what to do at the bottom end of the spectre. So I do believe that there isn't a proper conduit for ex-players to get into coaching, or coaches that are presently in the system, to grow up that ladder and to get into the senior provincial teams. I think there's definitely a gap there where, the development of coaches within the unions in South African rugby needs to be looked at.
Yeah, because I asked the question, Jake, because there are, besides the players that have left South Africa, there's also a bit of a coaching exodus, yourself included. But we've also seen recently the likes of Rassie Erasmus, Jacques Nienaber leave the country to go and coach elsewhere. And then we turn around and say, we don't have enough quality coaches. Do you think that's true? Do you think we lack insofar as the development of our coaches and ability of our coaches go? Or are we letting the best coaches go?
Well, let me put it this way. I think if every coach is not involved in South Africa now, gets together and picks players who are not playing in South Africa and challenges anyone in South Africa, I'd be very surprised if that group of players and coaches wouldn't win more than they lost. So to answer your question, Tola, I've got no doubt that the coaches abroad are and I'm not for one of saying, because you mentioned myself and Rassie, but even coaches in South Africa, you get ex-provincial coaches and national coaches now not even involved in rugby. And again, I look at the New Zealand setup. Plumtree was a head coach for X amount of years. He's gone back as assistant to Hurricanes. Mark Hammett was a head coach of the Hurricanes. He's gone as an assistant coach back to the Highlanders. I wonder if that sort of thing would ever happen in South Africa. Could you see Johan Ackerman going as a forwards coach back to the Stormers? Could you see Nick Mallett going as an assistant coach back to the system? Could you see, Peter de Villiers going back as a backline coach into one of the super franchises? And, at the end of the day, that's what the Kiwis do. There's nothing wrong in bringing coaches who've had a bash and they come back into their setup and they add value. I've repeated myself when I said to you about all those international coaches. But don't forget, as we speak, Todd Blackadder and Tobias Matson are coaching Bath. Yeah. Aaron Majors coaching Leicester. It won't be long before those guys return with all the intellectual property they've picked up abroad and they take it back to New Zealand. And then they share about what they pick up from a game point of view, and they share that with all the coaches in New Zealand. And I don't believe, as Robbie says, that I think it's wonderful that ex-players want to coach, and I think it's wonderful that guys like Robbie, and I know he's in the studio, wants to teach players how to scrum and talk to them about his days as a Springbok and teach those values to a player. But where does Robbie get upskilled? Where does he find out what he's doing is right, and where does he challenge himself? When all the coaches who I suppose that he's surrounded by are probably less experienced than he is. So it's something that, we can't beat around, Kola. If you want to be a rugby playing nation, you've got to make sure that you keep that intellectual property available to everybody. If a young schoolmaster wants to find out now, as I said, about how to get his backline to run straight, he's got absolutely no conduit in South African rugby to go and find out. He's only got a video that he can go and see. He's got it's all trial and error from his point of view. And, and then we wonder why we get left behind when other countries look as though they're so far advanced.
Yeah. Jake Ashwin, what does it say about the commitment of all of this expats, as you've called it now, as in comparison to New Zealand? Because you find with New Zealand that the coaches that remain, the players that remain in New Zealand, the ones that come back, they're there to serve New Zealand rugby. So is it perhaps a lack of commitment from everyone that is going abroad? Or is it, perhaps that they feel that the system have done them wrong? Or what do you think is the responsibility lying on their shoulders, seeing that we're talking about the fact that so many people or so many players and the brain trust of SA Rugby is leaving?
Yeah, actually, look, I think, I suppose that's a very interesting question because what it actually says is, what do we do to get them to stay? Well, I think one of the things that's very important is we shouldn't have open season for any one of our coaches. I mean, you look at what Alistair's going through now. Let's be fair and say that one thing we are very good at in South Africa is belittling and breaking down our national coach. And there's no way that any country is even close to the way we handle our provincial and national coaches. So look, I think that there's got to be a buy-in. But again, I think that one of the things that's got to happen is I think that it's got to be all in, and I think that every decision that gets made has got to be in the best interest of winning. And then you will keep those coaches. I think it's difficult if coaches are fighting the system all the time, or if they feel they're fighting the system all the time, then it's probably easier not to be involved. As I said, you look at all the coaches who are not coaching, who've had years and years of experience in South Africa, and then they just hang up and go and do something else. That means all that intellectual property just disappears. As you were there when obviously I was coaching, and for 10 years we were in isolation. We didn't know what the values were, or what the traditions were, or what. And that's sad. You're talking about a country like South Africa who for 10 years are not sure who sits at the main table and who sits in the front row of the photograph, and what is it like to be a Springbok, and what is it like to be a captain, and whereas I think that seamlessly goes along in New Zealand as a given. The Colin Meadses and the Sir Brian Lahores and the greats of All Black rugby make sure that the new generation understand exactly what it's like to be an All Black. And I think that it's not hard. It's not hard. I mean, what we're saying now is not that we can't do it. I think it's there to be done, and I think that if everyone buys in and everyone feels as though they're part of the bigger picture, you've got schoolmasters that are very good schoolmaster coaches, no different to anywhere in the world. In fact, if you look at our teams, Ashwin, our top 10 schoolboy sides are probably better than most countries' top 10 schoolboy sides, and that's also because they get coached. That's also because they're talented. So there should be no reason why we can't take those teams forward in the next sort of 5, 6, 7 years and turn them into great senior players.
Jake, when you say that the system breaks the coaches, I respectfully want to disagree. I've never been a coach. Obviously you would have more experience on that than me. But is it perhaps a case here where if you look at players, coaches break players? And we've seen this over the years. You as a coach know, certain players, under certain coaches, they might, have a bad game, never play again. So we can have that same, case for where we can say that the coaches break the players. But in terms of South Africa, here we've got, we compare ourselves to New Zealand. I mean, we're a nation that comes from an era where there was, an apartheid South Africa where, there was a white Springbok team, there was a black Springbok team, there was unification. And, in order to bring all of this together, it's going to take a momentous effort from everyone involved in the game. And do you not perhaps feel that, what we are trying to achieve as South Africa, as a rugby-playing nation, that have gone through a very particular challenge and now having to come through all of that and mature as a rugby-playing nation where we address the issues of transformation in the game, where we address the development of players on all different levels, where we ensure that the social dynamics, when we talk about school coaches and school play and school teams, we talk about the top 10, 20 school teams in South Africa. You find that the previously disadvantaged, historically disadvantaged schools don't feature there. So that imbalance is something that obviously have to be addressed. Now, when we look at South African rugby at this stage and we say, yeah, there's the coach Alistair and the system is breaking him, are we really being sincere to the system and what the system is trying to create? Or are we only looking from our own perspective and criticizing what we perceive to be a problem?
Yeah, look, Ash, what you say is right. Obviously, I've been a coach, and I can tell you from first-hand experience, it's very personal when people start to send messages all over the social media about, how bad you are and what you should do and everything. And it doesn't matter how tough you are or how resilient you think you are, it has a personal effect on you as a coach. So, obviously, I'm biased when I say that, and I would say that in South Africa, I've never experienced anywhere else in the world where people have a full go, at basically free for all on nailing coaches. But getting back to your point, Ashwin, Look, I don't think you'll ever get to the point where the previously disadvantaged schools that are stuck in the middle of nowhere would ever be able to compete with the cash-backed or cash-strapped schools out in the rich areas. But saying that, there's no doubt in my mind that where we are in transformation now is years ahead of where we ever were, 10 years ago. I looked at this under-18 side now that's played. I watched the under-18s with interest. That ball boy side that's dominated in terms of the players of colour, and I hate using that term, but it's in terms of South Africans, the way that they think. The captain, obviously a non-white player on merit, and Ash, that under-18 side dominates Wales, England, France every year for the last 4 or 5 years. Why do we struggle to say that we can't transform when that team that epitomizes everything about South Africa in terms of selection, in terms of colour, in terms of playing style, dominate their own age group, and yet we're saying, do we have enough players and are we transforming? I have no doubt that you can do both. I mean, 10 years ago we beat Australia and New Zealand with 9 players of colour and 6 players of colour, and people were considering it as an impossible mission. So, Ash, my feelings on that. I really believe that there's no doubt that there's enough players on merit in this country now as I speak. Jody Jenica is one of the better hookers in France, and he's a non-white player from Natal. Gustavo Steenkamp still dominates for Toulouse, and he's a non-white player. Pierre Oplan is one of the great players in France, and it's based. There's absolutely no quota system. Ricky January still plays for the first team at La Rochelle and plays well every single weekend. And I can tell you there's no quota system in France. You don't have to pick those players, because of the colour of their skin. And yet everyone in France is still trying to sign them up, still trying to bring them to their club. So, there's an example of 4 players playing in France that I think would probably be good enough to make any of our teams in South Africa on merit.
Jake, we're going to respectfully ask if we can keep you on. We're going to take a quick break and come back if you're okay with that, Coach.
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks, Dylan.
Fantastic. We'll be back in a couple of minutes. Use that hashtag #SSRugby. There have been 1 or 2 comments as well on Twitter. We continue the conversation shortly.